why this conservation comeback is so remarkable. In the 1800s, as many as 60 million bison were hunted nearly into extinction.
In the vast wilderness of Yellowstone National Park, there is a herd of animals that represents one of the greatest conservation victories in human history. For more than a century, scientists believed these bison were the closest thing left to a living time capsule, a direct connection to the animals that once dominated the American continent. In the 1800s, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison thundered across the Great Plains, shaping ecosystems and supporting entire civilizations. But within a single human lifetime, humans pushed them almost completely to the edge of extinction. Today, Yellowstone's bison are celebrated as survivors, a population rebuilt from the smallest possible foundation. For decades, researchers believed they carried something incredibly rare, a nearly untouched genetic legacy, a bloodline considered 99.7% wild, the last honest copy of a species America had nearly erased forever. But then, in the spring of 2022, everything scientists thought they knew about this legendary herd began to collapse. Geneticist James Durr and his team began analyzing the full genomes of Yellowstone bison, expecting the results to confirm what researchers had believed for generations. This was supposed to be a simple scientific confirmation, a final stamp proving that Yellowstone truly held the purest surviving bison population on Earth. But when the genetic data returned, researchers discovered something hidden deep inside the animal's DNA. Something that, according to everything they understood about this herd, should not have existed. Buried inside the bloodline of the most protected bison population on the planet was a genetic signature from another species entirely. A discovery so unexpected that it forced scientists to rethink not only Yellowstone's history, but the entire story of how the American bison survived extinction. For more than 100 years, Yellowstone's bison had been treated almost like living national treasures. The population was managed under one of the most careful conservation strategies ever created, involving federal agencies, the state of Montana, and Native American tribes. While many other bison herds across North America had been affected by human intervention, fencing, controlled breeding, and historical cattle bison experiments, Yellowstone's animals were believed to have escaped all of those influences. They were considered the last truly wild bison, the closest surviving example of what existed before the Great Destruction of the 1800s. That famous 99.7% figure was not just a number. It represented decades of scientific research and shaped the entire philosophy behind modern bison conservation. Yellowstone was considered the gold standard, the population that carried the strongest connection to the evolutionary forces that shaped the species. Researchers believed these animals represented the final untouched chapter of bison history. Their genetics were studied, their movements were controlled, and their isolation was carefully protected, because scientists believed they were guarding something that could never be replaced. But James Durr's research was never designed to challenge that belief. It was designed to confirm it. His goal was to prove that Yellowstone remained exactly what scientists had always claimed it was. Instead, his discovery created a moment of scientific shock. The study that was supposed to certify the story became the study that rewrote it. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, you have to go back to the moment when the American bison came closer to extinction than almost any other large animal in history. Imagine the Great Plains in the year 1873. The horizon is alive with movement. A seemingly endless river of animals stretches across the landscape. Millions of hooves shake the ground as enormous herds move across grasslands that seem to have no limits. These were not just animals wandering through the wilderness. The bison was the foundation of an entire world. Their grazing shaped ecosystems. Their presence determined the survival of countless plants and animals. Native nations built their food systems, economies, traditions, and spiritual practices around them. Then, in only a few decades, that world disappeared. The destruction was not slow and accidental. It was one of the fastest wildlife collapses ever recorded. Commercial hunters killed millions of bison for their hides, leaving mountains of abandoned carcasses across the plains. Trains carried the skins east, while passengers fired weapons from train windows for entertainment. But beneath the commercial slaughter was another devastating reality. Many military leaders understood that eliminating the bison would weaken the native nations who depended on them. Destroying the herds became a strategy as much as an industry. By the late 1880s, a population that once numbered in the tens of millions had collapsed to a shocking number. Only 541 wild bison remained in the entire United States. Scientists describe a collapse like this as a genetic bottleneck, a moment when an entire species is squeezed through an incredibly narrow survival path. More than 99% of the population disappeared, leaving only a tiny group of survivors to carry the entire future of the species. Every bison alive today traces its ancestry back to those few remaining animals. The genetic material they carried became the only foundation left for rebuilding an entire species. And among those survivors was a small group hidden in the mountain valleys of Yellowstone. It was the last place in America where wild bison had continued living on the same landscape for generations without being completely removed or domesticated. But even Yellowstone's survivors were not safe. By 1902, poachers were still entering the remote areas of the park, killing the remaining animals for trophies and collectors. When park officials finally counted what was left, the result was devastating. Only about 23 wild bison remained, a herd that small faced dangers beyond hunting. Scientists understood that a population reduced to only a few dozen animals could slowly collapse from within. Inbreeding could weaken the bloodline and erase genetic diversity over generations. The Yellowstone herd needed new animals, new genetics, and a chance to recover before it was too late. So, in 1902, officials made a decision that would shape the future of the species forever. They would rebuild Yellowstone's population by bringing in bison from outside the park. It was a practical solution, but it created one major problem. Almost nowhere else still had enough surviving bison to help. The rescue of the American bison was not created only by governments or famous scientists. Some of the most important heroes of this story were people history almost forgot. Long before officials recognized the crisis, native and frontier families were quietly protecting the last remaining animals. One of those people was a man remembered as Walking Coyote. In 1873, he crossed the Continental Divide carrying a small group of orphaned bison calves whose mothers had been killed during hunting. He brought them back to the Flathead Valley and raised them himself. Those few calves became the beginning of something extraordinary. By 1884, that tiny group had grown into a herd of around 13 animals. Walking Coyote eventually sold the herd to ranchers Michel Pablo and Charles Allard, who allowed them to roam across the Flathead Reservation. Over time, they expanded the population, purchasing additional animals from other surviving herds. Then came one detail that would become one of the biggest discoveries more than a century later. In 1893, Pablo and Allard purchased approximately 44 additional bison from rancher Buffalo Jones. The group contained 26 purebred wild bison and 18 documented cattle-bison hybrids. At the time, it seemed like just another step in saving a disappearing species. Nobody realized that hidden inside this rescue effort was a genetic secret that would remain buried for more than 120 years. By the late 1890s, the future of the American bison was hanging by the thinnest thread. But hidden among the scattered survivors were a few private herds that would become far more important than anyone could have imagined. By 1896, the combined Pablo-Allard herd had grown to nearly 300 animals, making it almost certainly the largest remaining collection of plains bison in the United States. At a time when the species had been reduced from tens of millions to a few surviving pockets, this herd represented one of the last hopes for recovery. But the path forward was not simple. When Charles Allard died that same year, his portion of the herd was divided among his heirs and sold to different private buyers. Meanwhile, Michel Pablo continued expanding his own herd, eventually raising it to nearly 700 animals as the Flathead Reservation moved toward opening for settlement. At almost the exact same time, far south in the Texas Panhandle, another unlikely conservation effort was taking shape. Rancher Charles Goodnight had created his own bison herd from a small number of southern survivors. Instead of allowing those animals to disappear with the rest of the southern herds, Goodnight's wife, Mary Ann, convinced him to protect them. Together, these scattered private efforts created something extraordinary. Without government funding, without a national conservation plan, and without recognition from the scientific world, a handful of ranchers and families were quietly preserving a significant portion of everything that remained of the species. But none of them knew what was hidden inside those bloodlines. They had saved the animals, but they had also unknowingly preserved a genetic mystery that would remain invisible for more than a century. And eventually, Yellowstone would come searching for exactly these animals. In 1902, when officials realized the Yellowstone herd had fallen to only 23 surviving wild bison, they needed a solution immediately. The park purchased 21 additional animals from these privately protected herds, including 18 females from the Pablo-Allard herd in Montana and 3 bulls from the Goodnight herd in Texas. The animals were loaded onto trains and transported across the country before finally arriving in Yellowstone's Lamar Valley. The plan seemed simple: bring together the 23 remaining Yellowstone survivors with these 21 newcomers, combine the two bloodlines, allow them to breed naturally, and rebuild a stronger population. And remarkably, it worked. That decision is the reason wild bison still roam Yellowstone today. At the time, it appeared to be a straightforward conservation success. A desperate rescue mission had succeeded. A species that was almost gone had found a second chance. But what nobody realized was that this single decision would become one of the most important genetic moments in bison history. Because while conservationists were rebuilding Yellowstone's herd, another story had already been unfolding across the American West. Years earlier, during the massive decline of bison populations and the increasing demand for meat production, some ranchers had begun experimenting with crossing domestic cattle and bison. Their goal was to create a stronger animal, one that could survive harsh winters, like a bison, while producing meat like cattle. They believed they were creating the perfect livestock animal. They even gave the hybrid a name, Catalo. But the experiment never became the agricultural revolution ranchers expected. The hybrids often failed to reproduce effectively, and many breeders eventually abandoned the idea. However, ending the experiment did not erase what had already happened. The animals that had been created did not simply disappear. Some remained mixed into private herds, hidden among animals that appeared completely normal. They carried genetic traces that could not be seen by looking at them. And some of those very same private herds would later become the foundation for rebuilding Yellowstone's population. The genetic connection was already there. It was already inside the rescue effort. And more than a century later, scientists would finally discover it. Even more surprising evidence appeared when researchers examined historical museum samples. They found traces of cattle DNA in bison specimens collected during the late 1800s, before many documented cattle-bison breeding programs had even begun. The discovery suggested that some level of mixing between cattle and bison may have been happening quietly on the open range much earlier than scientists originally believed. By the early 1900s, Michel Pablo's herd had grown beyond what the available land could support. He offered to sell hundreds of his bison back to the United States government, asking $250 per animal. But Washington refused. Officials offered only a fraction of that price, first $25 and later $75 per head. Pablo considered the offer an insult. So instead of selling his animals to the country that had nearly lost its bison forever, he sold them to Canada. Beginning in 1907, more than 700 of Pablo's bison were transported more than 1,000 miles north into Canada. Some were temporarily held at Elk Island National Park, while the majority were moved to a new conservation area known as Buffalo National Park near Wainwright. At first, the experiment looked like an incredible success. The herd expanded rapidly, reaching nearly 8,800 animals by 1921. But the population grew far beyond what the landscape could support. Overcrowding, disease, and management problems eventually forced Buffalo National Park to close in 1939. However, something unexpected happened. A small group of only 40 to 50 animals had remained behind at Elk Island as a demonstration herd. While the larger Wainwright population struggled, this overlooked group remained healthy. And decades later, that smaller population became one of the most important sources for bison restoration across North America. The species had now been divided between two countries, but both populations shared the same origin. Both descended from the small, complicated founder herds that had carried the bison through its darkest chapter. And slowly, those founders changed everything. By the middle of the 20th century, rebuilt bison populations had expanded into the thousands. They returned to national parks, wildlife reserves, and tribal lands across the continent. At the National Bison Range in Montana, one animal became a symbol of this incredible comeback. His name was Big Medicine. Born in 1933, Big Medicine was a rare white buffalo whose pale, almost ghostly appearance made him unlike any other bison alive at the time. For many native communities, his existence carried deep spiritual meaning. People traveled great distances simply to stand near him, offer prayers, and witness an animal considered extraordinary. When Big Medicine died in 1959, the world saw something remarkable. A species that had once been reduced to a few hundred survivors had become a symbol of renewal. The American bison had returned from the edge of extinction through the combined efforts of ranchers, conservationists, scientists, native communities, and individuals whose names were never recorded in history books. But there was one question nobody had been able to answer. What exactly had been brought back? More than a century later, Yellowstone's bison had become the ultimate conservation success story. A population that began with only a few dozen animals had grown into thousands, with recent estimates reaching around 5,400 bison roaming the park. For decades, scientists believed the herd carried two clear ancestral lines, one connected to the original 23 Yellowstone survivors, the other traced back to the Montana animals introduced in 1902. Through maternal DNA passed from mother to calf, researchers believed they could follow the family history of the herd directly through its genetic code. That belief transformed Yellowstone into the gold standard of bison conservation. it was considered the most genetically valuable bison population in North America. Conservationists worked tirelessly to keep the animals isolated from cattle, protecting them from outside influence. The goal was simple: preserve what they believed was the last truly pure bison genome on Earth. And that was exactly what geneticist James Durr wanted to confirm. Durr had spent more than 2 decades studying bison genetics at Texas A&M University. Alongside doctoral researcher Sam Straw and collaborator Brian Davis, he began one of the most detailed genetic investigations ever performed on the species. The team collected full genome sequences from bison representing major historical lineages and compared them against more than 1,800 domestic cattle genomes. They were searching for something extremely specific: tiny fragments of DNA that did not belong in a bison genome. Small genetic fingerprints left behind by cattle ancestry from breeding events that happened generations earlier. They expected to find those fragments in herds that already had a documented history of cattle-bison mixing. And they did. That part was not surprising. But then the researchers looked at another group: the protected herds, the legendary populations considered untouched. And that was when everything changed. Because the cattle DNA was not only found where scientists expected it, it was found where nobody thought it could exist. Every single bison genome analyzed contained identifiable regions of cattle DNA. Not most. All of them. The discovery did not stop with the private commercial herds where scientists expected to find traces of cattle ancestry. The real shock came when the same genetic signature appeared inside the populations that had been considered untouchable. The very herds that conservationists had protected for generations as the purest examples of wild bison were carrying the same hidden fragments. Yellowstone itself, the symbol of untouched wilderness, was not an exception. Neither was Elk Island in Canada, another population that earlier studies had examined and believed to be completely free of cattle influence. The amount of cattle DNA was incredibly small, almost invisible compared with the rest of the genome. One Yellowstone bison showed only 0.24% cattle ancestry. In other mixed populations, the numbers were slightly higher, ranging from around 0.5% to just under 2%. These were tiny genetic traces, so small that previous testing methods had simply been unable to detect them. For decades, scientists had been looking at the same animals with older technology, searching for a problem they did not even know existed. But the new genome analysis revealed something undeniable. The cattle ancestry was not concentrated in a few unusual herds. It was scattered across the entire species. For James Durr, the discovery was almost impossible to accept at first. He later described his initial reaction as complete disbelief, the kind of moment where a scientist wants to find a mistake in the data before accepting what the evidence is saying. After years of research built around the idea of Yellowstone's genetic purity, the results created a painful contradiction. The most carefully protected bison herd in the world was not completely pure. But the deeper scientists looked, the more fascinating the discovery became. Because those tiny genetic traces were not what made Yellowstone's bison less valuable. In fact, they revealed something much more important. The famous 0.24% cattle ancestry found in one Yellowstone animal is actually less foreign DNA than many humans carry from our own ancient relatives. People with European or Asian ancestry commonly carry around 2% or more Neanderthal DNA. In the strictest genetic sense, the supposedly mixed Yellowstone bison carried less outside ancestry than many humans carry within their own genomes. The discovery created one unavoidable question. How did cattle genes reach the one herd that everyone believed was beyond human influence? The answer was hidden inside the rescue itself. The contamination did not come from a modern accident. It was not caused by a cow breaking through a fence or a failure in today's conservation practices. The source was much older, and it was connected directly to the moment humans saved the species from extinction. To understand what happened, scientists had to return to the year 1902, when Yellowstone's desperate rescue mission began. Remember the 21 animals brought into the park: 18 females from the Pablo Allard herd in Montana, and 3 bulls from Charles Goodnight's herd in Texas. These were the animals that were supposed to save Yellowstone's last 23 wild survivors. But those rescue animals carried a complicated history. The private herds they came from were connected to ranchers who had experimented with cattle-bison hybrids decades earlier. The same bloodlines that helped preserve the species also carried small traces of those experiments. The animals that rescued Yellowstone were connected to the very breeding history that scientists would later discover hidden in their DNA. It was one of history's greatest ironies. The people who saved the American bison from disappearing were also, unintentionally, responsible for introducing a tiny genetic footprint from another species into the population they rescued. With one hand, they pulled the bison back from extinction. With the other, without knowing it, they permanently changed the genetic story of the species. Brian Davis described this as a complicated inheritance left behind by well-intentioned conservation efforts. The hybridization experiments of the past were not acts of destruction. They were part of a much larger story of survival. Without those private herds, without those ranchers protecting animals when almost nobody else cared, the bison might have vanished completely. And that creates the central contradiction of the entire discovery. The same bloodlines that carried cattle DNA were also the reason there were bison left to study at all. The rescue and the genetic mixing were not separate chapters. They were the same chapter, separated only by more than a century of time. This realization forced scientists to reconsider the way they viewed conservation itself. For decades, bison management had been built around one powerful idea: purity. Herds were compared based on how close they were believed to be to an untouched original state. Populations were valued, protected, and sometimes separated because of this idea. But now the foundation of that belief had changed. The most celebrated bison population in North America, the herd considered the ultimate example of genetic purity, contained evidence of a more complicated past. The reaction across the bison conservation community was immediate. Some breeders and conservationists struggled with the discovery because their entire philosophy had been built around maintaining pure bloodlines. Others argued that the amount of cattle ancestry was so small that it had no meaningful impact on the health or identity of the animals. But many geneticists saw the discovery differently. They argued that purity was never the right way to understand nature.